Our next speaker is Victor Kumar. Professor Kumar is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist. He writes about moral psychology, human evolution, and social justice. He is a member of the Moral Psychology Research Group and director of the BU Mind and Morality Lab. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kumar.
Thanks for that very kind introduction, Paul. Thanks everyone for coming and sticking around. As Paul said, I'm a professor in the philosophy department. I'm also the director of the Mind and Morality Lab, which is a research group that studies the science of morality and also scientifically informed ethics. We put on a series of talks each semester. The next one in mid-October is about implicit gender bias in STEM, women in STEM fields. So you can visit this website if you're interested in attending one of the talks. What I want to talk to you about today is one of the topics that we talk about in our lab. I want to talk about the science and ethics of empathy. So empathy is this special ability that we have to share each other's thoughts and feelings, to understand what others are thinking from the inside. And empathy seems like it's morally elevating. It seems like it's really important for not just our relationships, but also having a healthy society and for achieving moral progress. One of the people who most clearly articulates this positive message about empathy is the person who was at the center of American political life until the Great Fall. So this is what Obama says about empathy. There's a lot of talk in this country about the federal deficit, but I think we should talk more about our empathy deficit, the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to see the world through the eyes of those who are different from us, the child who's hungry, the steel worker who's been laid off, the family who lost the entire life they built together when the storm came into town. When you choose to broaden your ambit of concern and empathize with the plight of others, whether they are close friends or distant strangers, it becomes harder not to act, harder not to help. So one way of illustrating Obama's idea, and many other people's idea, about empathy is to think about recent problems related to immigration. There are a lot of people that come to this country because they're desperate to escape violence in their home countries. And one thing that the current administration has done recently is to house refugees taken at the border in deplorable conditions, separate families. And progressive activists, when they're trying to convince you of the injustice of this, one thing that they sometimes do is they ask you to empathize. They ask you to think about what it would be like to be separated from your child and not know where your child is being kept. So it seems like empathy is a progressive force. There's a psychologist, Paul Bloom, who thinks this is dead wrong, not just partially mistaken, but completely backwards wrong. And the reason is that empathy is biased. We're biased to feel empathy and sympathy and to care about people that are like us, people who are part of our social group, people who are members of the same race or class as us. So here's Bloom articulating this idea about empathy. Empathy is a spotlight focusing on certain people in the here and now. This makes us care more about them, but it leaves us insensitive to the long-term consequences of our acts and blinds us as well to the suffering of those we do not or cannot empathize with. Empathy is biased, pushing us in the direction of parochialism and racism. It is innumerate, favoring the one over the many. It can spark violence. Our empathy for those close to us is a powerful force for war and atrocity to others. So, Bloom says at one point in his book, I think, being against empathy is like being against love or being against kittens. I'm anti-kittens. But he thinks once you understand the way that empathy works and the way that it operates to bind people together in a family or in a tribe, that it's actually a negative moral force. So one way of thinking about this is to think back to immigration. It might be that people care about refugees because they empathize with them, or it may be that their empathy is just a symptom of their belief, like they already care about refugees, and that's why they're easily able to empathize with them. Or think about another example. Think about the way that certain politicians encourage anti-immigrant sentiment. The way that they often do that is by asking people to empathize with the victims of crimes committed by immigrants. So they'll ask you to think about what it's like to have your child assaulted by someone who came into this country illegally. The problem, and this is the way I think Bloom would put it, is that empathy is innumerate. It's focused on the here and now, one vivid case that's presented to you. It's blind to the statistical fact that immigrants commit fewer crimes on average than citizens. Okay, so what should we think about empathy? Let me take a quick poll. So I've given you Obama's view, and I've given you Paul Bloom's view. How many people think that Obama is right? How many people think that Bloom is right? Like 3 people, 5 people. So I don't think either Obama or Bloom is right about empathy. Both of them have very simplistic views about the way that empathy works. But I first want to take aim at Bloom's critique of empathy, his argument that you should be against empathy, that it's a negative force in morality. And I think one of the key mistakes that Bloom makes is he ignores the interaction between empathy and moral reasoning. The interaction between empathy and moral reasoning. So empathy is biased in all these ways. You feel more empathy that people that look like you, people the same race as you, and so on. But those biases are actually positive features when empathy is combined with moral reasoning. Okay? Now, to make good on that claim, to explain to you what I mean, I want to talk about a specific case. Oops, was I on the wrong screen the whole time? Nobody said anything? Thanks. So I want to talk about what I think is maybe the biggest moral event in our lifetimes. It's the revolution in gay rights, in people's attitudes towards gay people and gay marriage. This has been like a huge shift over the course of like a single generation. A majority of people once thought that gay marriage is wrong, and now a majority of people in this country think that gay marriage should be legal. And it's not just like people are lying on opinion polls and they're just like saying what they think the pollster wants to believe. There's a psychologist at Harvard, Mahzarin Banaji, who studies implicit bias. And one of the sad things that she recounts about implicit biases is they haven't really changed a lot in the last generation, in the last 30 or so years that psychologists have been studying them, with a couple of exceptions. And one of them is anti-gay implicit bias. And that's something that's actually reduced drastically over the last 20 or 30 years. Okay, so I think there's a really interesting empirical scientific question. What caused this change? What caused the gay rights revolution? I don't have the answer. No, there's lots of different factors that played a role in changing people's beliefs about gay people and about gay marriage. But I think lots of different pieces of evidence suggest that one of the causes was the large number of gay men and women living public and candid lives. And the thing about sexual orientation is that it's more or less randomly distributed across the population, which means that lots of people came to discover that a person they know is gay. They came to discover that their friend is gay, their sister is gay, their work colleague is gay. And because they were already biased towards these people, because they had a close personal friendship with them, that allowed them to more easily empathize with their friend or family member that's gay. Now that's a kind of local moral insight. You empathize with someone and it's easier to see all the harms that they're a victim of, the way in which their liberty and love is curtailed needlessly. So there's a kind of local moral insight that's sparked by empathy, but it's reasoning that allows people to generalize that insight. People reasoned that if there's nothing wrong with their cousin's sexual orientation, there must not be wrong with the sexual orientation of so many other strangers that they don't know. They realize things like, well, I can't maintain these disparaging generalizations about gay people without applying them to my son or my friend as well. Okay, so I don't think what you should conclude from what I've been talking about related to the gay rights revolution is that empathy is good. Empathy is bad too. Empathy that you feel towards people from the same social group as you also feeds racism and classism and other social ills. In Bloom's book, Against Empathy, he poses this question here: is empathy good or bad? Now, not to put too fine a point on this, but that's a bad question. It's a dumb question. The only reasonable answer to that question is that empathy is good in some ways and bad in others, which is about as unilluminating as you can be. So I think the first thing that you need to do if you want to answer moral and scientific questions about empathy is to start asking some better questions. And so one better question worth asking is, when is empathy likely to be good or bad? Or in what progressive movements and under what conditions is empathy likely to be a useful, valuable moral tool? Now, to say a little bit more about part of the answer to that question, part of what I think is the answer to that question, I want to ask you to think about two different kinds of big moral problems that we face in this society and many others. One of them is the problem of outsiders. This is the problem of treating other people like they don't matter, like they don't count morally, dehumanizing people. So this problem of outsiders applies to people from certain races and ethnicities. It applies to gay and trans people, to homeless people, to non-human animals. Some people are thought not to count morally. So that's top left. But there's another big moral problem. The other type of big moral problem is the problem of subordination. So some people aren't treated as outsiders. They're not treated as not part of the social group, but they're treated as being suited to having inferior roles within a social group. And the fundamental problem is a kind of inequality. And I'm not talking about inequality of wealth or inequality of well-being, but inequality of social power, like not being able to participate fully, to have your voice fully heard in the political institutions of your country. That's a kind of problem of subordination, where some people are part of a group, but they're assigned low positions in a social hierarchy. Now, there are some moral problems that are both problems of outsiders and problems of subordination. So I think anti-Black racism in this country is both about being other and less than. But there are other problems that are more clearly, mostly problems of subordination. So I'm thinking of things like class injustice. And I think the problem of subordination is what's at the heart of the patriarchy. So it's not that women are thought of as not counting morally by some men, by misogynists. It's not that they don't count. They're not part of our group. They are part of our group, but they're suited to socially inferior roles. That's what people think, because maybe of their supposed biological nature. Now, I don't think empathy is useful for addressing and confronting problems of subordination. And the reason is that when your victims are close by, you have to construct a complicated and sophisticated ideology that justifies their subordination and that constrains or deactivates the emotions like empathy and sympathy and care that might overturn a hierarchy. If you didn't have that kind of ideology that protected people from moral emotions, the ideology and patriarchal institutions would have already collapsed. But I do think that empathy is really important for solving problems of outsiders. It's important not by itself, but in combination with moral reasoning. And the reason is that in some cases, not all of them, our social groups overlap. And people who are once treated as outsiders, you realize that they're part of your group as well. Empathy can't work alone. We need to encourage moral reasoning. Empathy isn't a panacea, it's not a cure-all, but it's our best hope for expanding the moral circle. Thanks. All right, questions? Who's pro-patriarchy?
I just really appreciate your talk, that's all.
Thanks, that's very kind of you.
No, really, especially as some unidentified faculty member who's taught here for more than half my life. This is just covers all the kinds of things I think about, and I was looking forward
Thanks.
to it, and you certainly did a great job, so thanks a lot.
Thank you. Back there.
Hello.
Hey.
So my question is, how do you suppose when is empathy useful when it comes to things that are more complicated, in law issues, something such as the death penalty? There across the nation, there's several states that oppose the death penalty, and there are some states that support the death penalty. And with reasoning, you could certainly, with more reasoning and empathy, could give both sides of the cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering
No, that's a great question. It's a great question. How is empathy useful for thinking about people who in prison who've been assigned the death penalty, or if empathy is not useful, what is? I think one way in which empathy gets disabled, it's not very useful, is when you have a lot of segregation, like formal or informal segregation. So one of the reasons that anti-Black racism is such a persistent problem in this country is because there's an extraordinary amount of racial segregation. Now, I think that is suggestive when thinking about the problem that you're interested in, which is, in general, people receiving what you might think are cruel and inhuman punishments in our criminal justice system. And one of the problems here is that there is a kind of segregation. I mean, not just physical segregation, because some of us are free and others are in jail, but there's a kind of segregation in our imaginations where there's nothing that encourages us to imagine the lives that people are leading in prisons. Or there are lots of barriers to imagining what their childhood must have been like, what their social environment must have been like to lead them to commit those crimes. So, I think one step that might be useful, and we don't know unless experiments in living are conducted, is to try to break down some of these walls and to expose people more to the lives that prisoners lead before and after they go to prison. I'm reminded of, this reminds me of these so-called ag-gag laws that forbid people from documenting the torture and abuse that goes on in factory farms. It's a good strategy, these ag-gag laws, because by segregating us from the problem, it's much more difficult for empathy and imagination to be exercised. So I think that's one possible way of thinking about that problem.
At one point, when you were discussing empathy and with refugees, you seem to differentiate between, if I heard you correctly, you seem to differentiate between having empathy for a person or group of people and caring about a group of people, because you said, does empathy cause caring, or does caring cause empathy? And I consider those like synonymous. So could you clarify what the differentiation is between having empathy for someone and caring about them?
That's great. So what's the difference between empathy and care? As it happens, there are two kinds of psychological processes in the neighborhood here. That's people both use the word empathy to refer to. There's empathy in the sense of understanding what another person is thinking and feeling. That's what I've been using by the term empathy. And then things like care or compassion or sympathy, that's a different psychological mechanism. That's about feeling for someone, feeling concern for someone. You can have one but not the other. Arguably, people with antisocial personality disorder are good at empathy. They can put themselves in your place and figure out what you're thinking, what you're afraid of. They just don't care. In fact, they do care. They just care about using that information to manipulate and exploit you as much as they can. So these are two distinct things. However, in most normal people, they're linked together. And often it's best to think of them not as separate so much, but as part of what you might call the empathy-sympathy loop. When you empathize with someone generally, and they're in pain or they're suffering, that leads you to care about them. But it works the other way too. If you care about someone, you're more likely to take up their perspective. You're motivated to take up their perspective. So I think for lots of purposes, and the ones that I was talking about in particular, the way we react to refugees or other people who are treated as outsiders, it's really, we want to think about how this empathy-sympathy loop works, how empathy and sympathy work together.
So empathy refers to understanding the cognitive processes of another person and being able to put yourself inside their head regardless of the emotional aspect. And then sympathy is what you would define as the emotional aspect of actually caring for another person the way that you would care for yourself or for your children or something like that. So is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Yeah. I think we're done. Thank you.